The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Awesome. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first installment of Basic Training Family Edition. My name is Rabbi Mark Rotenberg, and I am the minister to the community as well as a facilitator here at Recovery Boot Camp and also the case manager. With me this evening is my friend and colleague, David Zaif. Come on over here, Dave. Dave is our executive administrator, and he is also the head facilitator for the Recovery Dynamics in Recovery Boot Camp. And if you guys have any problems whatsoever, technical or any questions, email Dave.
I'm your man. Any questions you have, you can also ask them in the webinar in the question box. I'll be doing my best to answer them as quickly as possible. If I don't get to you right away, fear not. I definitely will. We're expecting a lot of questions, so just be patient with me, but I'm on it. So anything you guys need, you contact me. I'll make sure you're all good to go, okay? Cool.
We're waiting for them to say okay, but that's an impossibility at this moment. So I'm going to assume that everybody can see the PowerPoint slide. And if you can't, when I click through it, make sure you immediately send an email or connect to Dave, and we will figure out how to do that. So as I said, my name is Rabbi Mark Rotenberg. I am a certified drug and alcohol counselor, as well as a therapist and a clinical pastoral counselor. I've been in the field for over 17 years, and today, oddly enough, is my sobriety birthday. I've been sober for 18 years through a 12-step fellowship, which means that I was a junkie and an alcoholic as well. What I would like to encourage you guys to do right now is print off the handouts that we have available on the website. There's going to be 3 assessments, and those assessments, what we'd like you to do is take them now. And what they do is they reflect where you stand in terms of your enabling with your identified patient or family member. And then at the end of the series, close to the tail end of the series, we are also going to retake the tests so that you have a calibration to judge how far you've come and what you've learned and how you understand. So we're going to go through a quick run through. First of all, though, I would like to ask you a question. And that question should be, why are you here? And I would love to have you type a response to that. That would be awesome. And we can field some of those. So there's something on my screen.
It's the question.
Oh, why are you here? All right. So either I have a family member that is actively using, I have a family member who's in treatment and like a little bit more information. I wish to be educated about addiction and recovery in general, and I wish to be more informed about the crisis because we are in the midst of a crisis in this country, both in the opiate crisis as well as alcohol and other drugs. And it seems to be escalating continuously over the last 10 to 15 years. On the upside, there are more availabilities like this for you to become informed and become aware of the whole disease process and the treatment regimen that occurs in recovery. Now, we are going to spend, when we initially had you sign up, we saw a lot of the questions that you guys posted first. And we noticed that a lot of them had to do with enabling. And enabling is a big part of this presentation. It is, however, closer down towards the middle, approaching the end of the presentation, and it's for a specific reason. And that reason is, in fact, that the information that I'm going to present probably in the first 3 or 4 weeks, maybe even 5 of this program, is going to be all about the specific disease of addiction, its pathologies, the way we deal with it, how it's treated, what our approaches is, what multiple approaches are, and how the new sciences come to terms in terms of neurology and neuropsychology to understand in depth more of the disease of alcoholism and drug addiction. Enabling, I could sit here and give you a blanket idea of like, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, and don't do this to help you stop enabling or be enmeshed or hyper engaged with your family member. But the truth is that it becomes very specific to the individual patient and the family member based on their dynamic. And in order to understand how you yourself should engage or restrict yourself from engagements with your identified patient, you really need to know a lot of the real brass tacks information about addiction in general. And so we're going to cover a lot of the technical realities about that. And we're going to do that so that when you come to the place where we start to learn about how to have boundaries and healthy lines that we don't cross that actually help our family member instead of enable them, you can find specific approaches for your specific situation. And these things are actually going to increase the efficacy of your interaction with your family member. So I see that in terms of the poll results, we have about 45% of you that are here because you have a family member which is actively using. What I've known professionally and personally in my experience is that when family members get involved in their own recovery process, vis-a-vis as relationship to their identified patient or family member, they increase the efficacy and the long-term probability of recovery for their family member exponentially. And we will talk about all those types of numbers as we go along. So let me move to the second screen. Right, I got it. Click, hit. Technical difficulties.
Click it. The mouse is backwards.
The mouse is backwards. That would be click. Look at that. So let's give an overview of the curriculum. I figured that we should run through the entire process in short so you can really see what it breaks down to and what it talks about. What we're going to talk about in our first section is the introduction to addiction and recovery in general, which is going to cover modes of diagnosis, modalities of treatment, all of those factors that come into the different models from the history all the way up until present time. Then we're going to spend a great deal of time talking about the recovery model in depth, the 12-step paradigm, which is a standalone cognitive behavioral approach, which incorporates 3 of the most effective modern psychological techniques in dealing with cognitive alteration or behavioral change. We are then going to talk about spirituality. And I'm sure that a lot of you have preconceived notions about spirituality. You know, the thing that makes me the most crazy is when I hear people go, yeah, you know, like I'm spiritual, not religious. And I ask them, what does that mean? They go, you know, spiritual. Like, because those are the type of things that are the misinformation that flies around. And spirituality is a great part of this recovery process. And we'll talk about it in terms, not in a pseudo-religious reality, but in a more clinical way. We're then going to talk about the signs of surrender. These are markers to see progress in both the patient and the family member, because surrender must occur also within the family and their own health and development. And so with the parent, with the family versus the patient and the client. On the next slide, we see that we're going to talk about the phases of recovery. And we break those into stages, specifically 3 main phases. This program itself contains 3 main phases. And we're going to reconcile those as where the client should be, where you should be as a family member, and where you want to go to. So those are going to involve the patient as well as the family. Then we have an entire section that's about the family's journey, because the journey for the family is just as important as the journey for the patient. Because the family must, let's be frank, alcoholism and drug addiction is the only mental illness that you can catch by osmosis. You start to get sick by being in close proximity to an active user and even someone in early recovery, which is why 12-step fellowships like Al-Anon and CODA and families of addiction have existed for so long, because what we find is that we have to work on our own mental health, and in doing so, we increase the probability of success for our family member. We're then going to talk about enabling, right? We're going to talk about all the general information of what that is, how to understand the difference between boundaries, behavior, help, and enabling. And we're going to spend probably 1 or 2 full sessions discussing specifically questions and answers, where you're going to be able to bring your own circumstances unique to your own particular family to the table. And what we're going to do is we're going to review those and give you some solid direction and advice in a individualized way. What we find is that a lot of questions that are individual to a family reflect other families, but the way you approach it or apply that solution within your own family dynamic is what makes it inherently unique. Another reason why we really have to understand the pathology of addiction prior to disseminating the information about enabling as well as boundaries. We are then going to talk about the phases of care and healing. And healing is a continuum as opposed to a cure. And this is a long-term protracted reality. And it's going to be amazing to recognize your own change. And I will actually give you scorecards in a way where you can gauge your own progress. Because what we find is in any type of cognitive or behavioral change process, the change can be so incremental that it's hard for us to recognize how far we're moving. And a lot of times the only way we can see that is in retrospect, look at where we've been and where we've come to in the moment. So we'll give you some hints about how to, scorecard your own progress. Then we're going to, at the end, reassess this family health assessments. These are the ones that I'd like you to download today and fill out according to the instructions. And you can actually send back or email or post the numbers that you have. And we will reveal after the second time that we do the assessments, after all the information has been gathered, and after you've done some work and try to implement some of these practices, your own change for yourself, and thereby giving you a better understanding of where you are in relationship to your family member who is the identified patient. And then we're going to close in a conclusion, which will probably be 1 or 2 sessions. And we're going to specifically talk about things. The first idea is what to look for. There's going to be information that you can almost keep next to your phone, that when you receive calls from your family member who's either in treatment or is still actively using, you can use this as a scorecard in essence to understand whether they're trying to manipulate you, what the hustle is, whether they're being genuine and honest, where their integrity stands, how their change is happening internally. Again, another scorecard. Scorecards are hugely important. Tracking is of major, major importance when dealing with a disease that is long-term, imminently treatable, yet uncurable in its reality. We're going to talk about insight, both for us as the family members, as well as the insight that we can expect to see in our identified patient family member. We're then going to spend time talking about relationships, specifically the family relationships that we have, the family relationships that the identified patient has, as well as relationships we have as family members with others, vis-a-vis support groups, as well as the relationships that our family member has with his or her support groups. We're going to close with a gauge of spiritual development based on our original definition of how we approach the idea of spirituality. And finally, we're going to close with a list of markers that we can see which may be traps or hazard. In other words, stumbling blocks for both ourselves as family members as well as the identified patient. So that was a lot of information, and I'm sorry to dump it all on you, but I wanted to just give you a taste and a tease of what we're looking at over this process, because we're looking at about an 8 to 10 week process, and there's going to be a copious amount of information. I also understand, Dave, that they can download the entire prospectus, the whole program. Is that possible for them? Did they get the entire thing?
Yeah. So guys, if you're watching and you're interested in maybe looking at the PowerPoints on your own time, or perhaps viewing this at a later date, we're working on that. So that's in progress. But for now, what you see is what you get. And as soon as we have everything available to send to you, we'll let you guys know. But in the meantime, we'll view it here for now. When we compile it to send out, we'll do that. And Mark also touched on the handouts. If you guys can see those on there, make sure you download those and do the assessments. They're really important. And if you have questions on how to do that, you can just type them in the question box and I'll field your questions, okay?
Also, I believe that further down the line in the next few weeks, there's going to be, because I know this is a major commitment for a lot of people, and life happens and things come up. I know that there's going to be the ability to review if you missed a session. It's going to be posted probably both on the RBC website as well as the foundation website, right? All right, so let's start with the general information. So we're going to talk about the idea of addiction and the idea of recovery, right? Things that are at opposite ends of the spectrum. We're going to start by covering the modalities or models of addiction, okay? So there are, in fact, 3 specific models. There is the disease model, which talks about the mesolimbic system, the brain health, and how the reward system and the stressor system, which exists in the mesolimbic part of the brain, is affected by chronic usage, can be either developed, have genetic predispositions, and the progression of the disease of alcoholism and drug addiction, which both grow in the exact same way. We're then going to unpack what is called the biopsychosocial model. It's a triumvirate model, and most models in diagnosis are triumvirate. In fact, the third model or tertiary model, which is the community disease model, is a model that's employed today by the CDC for things like vectoring of diseases, because it takes into account the three-way factors. And most diagnostic models have three factors. And what we find is that that's mirrored in the recovery model, which also has three factors. And that's where we're gonna look at the recovery model. We're gonna look at it generally in relationship to the other two models, and then we're gonna look at it in depth in terms of the processes, the neurology, the spirituality, the behavioral therapy, the neurolinguistic programming. There's a lot of layers to it. And then we're going to wrap it all up in a conclusion. So the question I have for you is, how many of you believe that addiction is a disease? I'll give you a couple seconds to answer yes or no. And while you're doing that, we can start talking about the disease model. In order to understand the classic disease model of addiction, we have to discuss the history of addiction and the history of treatment of addiction in this country. We have to look at the ideas of Western medicine, which tend to be geared towards cure and acute focused versus chronic focused. We need to talk about awareness and stigmas, as well as ASAM, which is the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and how they are inherently changing the face and understanding of addiction as a disease, not just among communities, but as well as among the medical field. So that's pretty good results, right? We have a 95% response in the affirmative that addiction is a disease, and 5% not. So I'm not going to castigate anybody that has a differing opinion. What I will in fact say is that a lot of the resistance to the idea of a disease model is predicated on the choices that are made by the addict himself involved in picking up. But when we get into the models and talk about genetic predispositions, allele groupings, and the factors that in essence conspire to make someone an addict. I mean, all of us know people, excuse me, who even when we grew up with or who we are friends with, who drink a lot or smoke weed or even party periodically, and they make the same choice that many addicts make, yet they don't really develop or become the full-blown addicts that a lot of the people that we know are as well. So there's interesting dichotomies, and there's some very interesting numbers that lend a lot of scientific credence to the idea of the disease model. In fact, early on in the late 40s, early 50s, the National Institute of Health had accepted the idea of addiction as a brain disease in terms of its diagnostic techniques. So let's move on. Oops, got to click. Here we go. Let's move on. So here is a basic kind of like slope analysis of alcoholism. And whenever we say alcoholism, we're really talking about all addiction. And oddly enough, the same processes exist not only for substance addictions, but for process addictions as well. Gambling, porn, sex, shopping. These things follow the same pathological increase in terms of tolerance and usage as do addictions of substances. So we see that it starts off with social drinking or using, and then there's an increase in the tolerance. And we know this for everything. And it doesn't just have to be drugs. When I have an experience and that experience continues, my reaction to the experience or the impact of that experience on me tends to diminish, or at least perceptibly diminishes. And it's not because the experience is diminished, it's because my tolerance to the experience has occurred over and over again. So in essence, I become almost immune to some of the subtleties and intensities of that particular experience. And that happens with drugs and alcohol as well, on top of a development of a physical tolerance. And there's a tolerance curve that is followed closely by what is called the LD50 curve, which is the lethal dose curve. And it's projected over time and intensity of use. So we see that there's uncomfortable situations where people start to use and there's no alcohol, or they go to a place where there's no alcohol and they'd rather be somewhere else, right? There starts to become a preoccupation with drinking. Social events are formed around that type of work. I got a pregame. I got to go to the tailgate party. You know, if I miss some of the first quarter, it's okay because I got to get my drink on, things of that nature. It then goes into lying about drinking and things of that nature. You know, we talk in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it says that if you don't know whether you're an alcoholic, you should attempt some controlled drinking. What I found personally as well as professionally is that I'm a real drunk and a real addict. And I didn't spend a lot of effort controlling my drinking and using. However, I did exert a tremendous amount of effort trying to control how much people knew I was drinking and knew I was using. And that becomes one of the stages. Now I start to have problems, loss of jobs, showing up late, negative consequences start to pile up. Yet I continue to use in spite of those negative consequences. We have the onset of long runs and lengthy drunks. I try geographical escapes. I try to change jobs. I try to change friends, right? My tolerance, oddly enough, starts to decrease because my ability to process the drugs and alcohol through my liver and kidneys and endocrine system starts to not work as well. So it's funny. Have you seen like the classic image of the drunk is the guy sitting on the sidewalk with a bottle of Ripple in a paper bag. It's a half a pint. And he's drinking it and he's just completely smashed the whole day. And the reason is because at that stage, you go from living to drink to drinking to live. And that's where the curve starts to change, right? That's where it really starts to get critical because if my liver is not processing it up to its full potential, then I have to drink to stay inebriated to prevent myself from going into a seizure or having withdrawal or delirium tremors. But if I drink just even the slightest bit too much, I can shut my liver down, cause a tremor. So it's literally drinking to live. It's literally using to live. I am dope sick in the morning. I have to get well. Then I have to do my hustle and go do my little crime or whatever my little hustle is. Then try to get high and then repeat the whole thing all day. Interestingly enough, what we find is one of the biggest complaints of people in early recovery is they approach it this way. They say, sobriety is boring. Well, it's really not. What's boring is doing the exact same thing every single day, trying to get well, trying to get my hustle on, trying to get my dope, trying to get high, trying to go to bed and do the same thing over and over. In a life like that, which is a continuum of just the same behavior over and over, the only real variables are, am I going to get arrested or am I going to get ripped off? If we look at it honestly, that is the most boring existence that there is. The beauty about recovery is that it is so random and things occur all the time that if you learn to develop one of the promises of the 12-step paradigm is situational awareness. I'm willing to recognize impact that's subtle and minute and everything is new on it or renewed on a daily basis. So it's really a bad argument, right? It's a false equivalency. So they hit the bottom, right? They're obsessed with drinking. They feel complete abandonment by all their friends, and they start either at that time to continue on the continuum of deterioration, physically, mentally, and bodily, or they actually are forced or decide to come to a place of asking for help. Oddly enough, it's when people say that they chose recovery that initially it's almost an impossibility. And we'll talk about that later on when we talk about the transition into the bottom, the true emotional state, and how we come into recovery and treatment. Then we dry out and we start to increase our meetings. We get treatment. We go to an environment where we're separated from our agent of harm. We start to have meetings in our life and fellowship and support and people on the same path. And we start going in the upscale towards the goal of recovery, which becomes a continuum for our lives. Feel free to look at this at length. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the disease model. And we'll bring in the history of it as it's related to AA, because specifically at the birth of AA in the 30s, there was a conflict in the American Medical Association and Western medicine in general. So Dr. Silkworth is a doctor who ran an alcoholic sanitarium for 40 years, I believe, Dave, almost 40 years in New York. And he wrote a piece in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous called The Doctor's Opinion. So let me just check this off. We got this one. Oh, I forgot to ask you another question. The second question was, for those 95% of you that believe that it's a disease, what type of disease is it? And if you were paying attention, you would see that it is a neuro disease that has a fatal progression. So the question is, are you familiar with the progression of the disease? The one that we just described in detail. Okay. If you do believe, what type of disease is it? Is it treatable and acute, or is it curable and acute? Good question. So back to Dr. Silkworth. Dr. Silkworth was drug addicts and alcoholics in an alcoholic sanitarium in New York for years and years and years. One of the co-founders of AA was one of his patients, and he contributed a preface to the book, which actually originally was not a preface, but was in the body of the text. And it was called The Doctor's Opinion, and it started on page 1. In the second edition of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, The Doctor's Opinion was now moved to become in Roman numerals prior to the beginning of the book. And the question is why? And there's a lot of debate about it. And the Doctor's Opinion is basically his empirical experience that he saw, where he dictates his own diagnostic criteria of alcoholism, right? Treatable and acute, manageable and chronic, 63%. It is treatable and it can be acute, but in reality, over the long term, it tends to be manageable and chronic. No one ever comes out the other end of that acute disease. It becomes minimized and treatable over a long period of time, which is manageable. Very similar to diabetes, along the same type of lines. So Dr. Silkworth wrote in The Doctor's Opinion a definition or a diagnostic criteria of the alcoholic, and he doesn't use the term denial, which is used today. He uses this particular term. He states from his experience that alcoholics are outright mental defectives in full flight from reality who cannot differentiate between true and false. We will talk more about this down the line, and we will talk about the new neurology and the new evidence and quantifiable data to prove that his suppositions originally they were true then, but now they're quantifiably true now. And he did not sign this letter that he wrote, because to look at the Book of Alcoholics Anonymous is to look at it as a philosophical text, which is really a suppositional book at best. All philosophy is suppositional. And so in the first edition, without it being signed, he presented it as an opinion of philosophy, of his own experience about the mindset and being of the alcoholic and the addict. Between the first edition and the second edition, there was a doctor at Harvard, his name was Dr. Jelinek, who had done a lengthy study of alcoholism and drug addiction in the community to the tune of thousands and thousands of patients. What resulted from that particular research project was a classification of alcoholics and addicts from alpha through omega. And it started to become accepted by the AMA, became peer reviewed, and all of a sudden there was a change in the mindset of Western medicine, accepting, even in the late 40s, alcoholism and drug addiction as a true neurological disorder and a brain disease or a physiological disease. When this came out, we see that there was a revision in the doctor's opinion in the Big Book, and that revision was that he signed his name. And he signed his name because now his opinion has been supported by studies and evidence in the medical community. In doing so, it could no longer be considered a philosophical trieste, and it was moved as the corroborating data that is in the front of the book. Because the solution, although empirically proven to be effective many, many times, still resides in the realm of philosophy, because we're talking about a change of ideas, a change of patterning. It's inherently a philosophical movement. Just as an aside, those of you that know, that have ever read Time magazine, at the turn of the centuries, they always have the most influential books. And in the year 2000, when they released the list of the most influential books of the 19th century, the book Alcoholics Anonymous made the top 5 list. It was preceded by the Bible and followed directly by Mein Kampf. Didn't say good books, said influential. So Jelinek produces this entire classification, which allows diagnostics to be accepted by the American Medical Association, and alcoholism and drug addiction starts to enter the lexicon of Western medicine. Oops. Click. Every time one of these things popped up, I got to click. On the next slide, what we have, sorry, we're working out the bugs. It's my first time. I'm a beginner. So we have kind of a basic kind of flow chart about the development of Alcoholics Anonymous through a secondary evangelical group that actually preceded it, called the Oxford Group. And the Oxford Group came from the ideas of Carl Jung and moral psychology, combined with a man named Roland Hazard, who was one of Jung's patients. And you can see it starts with Roland Hazard, and Carl Jung starts to see this idea of a need for a vital spiritual experience. And he starts to understand that religious experiences or church inculcation is ineffective. It has to be internal out instead of external in. This gets transferred to the Oxford Group, where Roland becomes a member. Excuse me. Fairly quickly, there are other people that come into, alcoholics that come into this group, one by the name of Ebby Thatcher. And Roland rescues Ebby from a court date where he was about to be committed as a terminal drunk who's in a hopeless state. Long story short, Ebby finds sobriety, and in the book is quoted as saying, "I got religion." And he does an intervention of sorts, or a 12-step call on Bill Wilson, who is the first founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith are the two founders of this program. And together, they have created a fellowship, I would venture to say a society that today stands at almost 11.2 million members worldwide at a mere 82 years of existence. When I think about it, my mother was a teenager before Alcoholics Anonymous even existed. It's baffling. So Bill goes to Towns Hospital in Brooklyn, where he encounters William Silkworth. Silkworth was familiar with Carl Jung's moral psychology, or the need for what is called psycho-spiritual change in a psychological paradigm, and instills this information or transfers it to Bill, who has an experience. Bill has a spiritual experience of an intense variety and leaves the hospital sober. He struggles to lecture to people and try and get others to get sober for about 6 months, whereupon he takes a trip to Akron, Ohio for a hostile takeover of a rubber company that happened to be there. I think it starts with a G and ends with year. And what he does is he's in a hotel, and the takeover didn't go well. Things are not looking good. He's standing in the lobby, and he hears the clinking of the glasses in the lobby bar. And so he goes into a payphone, and at that time they had lists of pastors and clergymen, and he finds a list, and he's got his nickels out. And he's calling and calling and calling and calling and calling and asking, does anybody know if there's a drunk? Because even though he hadn't succeeded in getting anyone else sober, his efforts in talking to other people about his own sobriety has in fact kept him sober. And he was almost at his wit's end. He runs out of nickels, and he goes back to his room, and he calls the last guy on the list, Reverend Tungst. Reverend Tungst just happens to be a guy who is connected with the Oxford group in Akron, Ohio. And he sets up a connection with a woman whose name was, it slips my mind immediately, but she was part of the Goodyear family. And she says, I know a doctor who is really bad, and you should talk to him. They talk together. What should have been a 10 or 15-minute conversation turns into 2 hours. They start to get completely together all the time, continuously talking and expanding and sharing their stories. And on June 10th of 1935, Alcoholics Anonymous is born. And that was with Dr. Bob Smith. And that's basically the beginning of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's kind of how the flow chart goes. And it's interesting because, I don't know, what are the odds, right? Like all the different factors and variables that had to go into it turned into something that has now, in essence, changed the face of the world. So back to the disease model. Let's talk a little bit about Western medicine and Western medical training. I'm not going to cast aspersions. I will say, however, that in terms of addictionology and alcoholism and the teaching in Western medicine, it is very limited. And it tends to be a elective in most medical schools in the West. And the reason is because the Western approach to medicine has always been cure-based. You show up with an acute problem, I do what I need to do, surgically, intervention through medicines, and I cure the circumstance. What we find is that alcoholism and addiction is not curable, much like diabetes. And if you look at the Western medical field, you notice that there's not a lot of specialties that are focused on incurable diseases, with the exception of cancer and oncology. So we find that the Western approach is cure, whereas the Eastern approach, or slightly more esoteric medical approaches, is more healing-based. And so there, like I said, there's limited coursework, and most of those are elective in Western medical schools. Thankfully, that is changing. So how is it changing? Well, it changes in awareness because we start to see an increase, and it has to do with cultural identity. Previously, almost never did you see on a death certificate whatever cause of death that was listed as alcohol related. But that has changed, and it changed for the better, but also that awareness actually changed in a not so good way. For example, what percentage of the world's pain medication is consumed by citizens of the United States? Is it 20%, 40%? 57%, or 80%? It's a good question. So this starts to become a real thing. Most of you have probably seen in a hospital or an ER the pain scale with the little faces. So Congress passes a patient's rights amendment, and what it does is that it guarantees speedy cessation of pain. I remember when I was young, and I went to the dentist, and I had a root canal, and I got like 3 or 4 Vicodins. It was a triplicate. I had to take, it was carbon copy, and that had changed. Now pain medications were much more easily prescribable because of this patient's rights amendment. And it created a fear of malpractice. Like people didn't want to be sued. Doctors didn't want to be sued because they didn't give this speedy cessation, but it kind of backfired. 75%, pretty good. That is right. 75% of you said that 80% of the world's pain medication is consumed by Americans, and that is true. I'm pretty sure we don't have 80% of the pain. And so we see this increase in opioid prescriptions, more availability, patients' rights, and we see that the pharmaceutical companies are more than happy to supply these pain medications. There's an upswing in productivity and sales of these things. And we notice that more and more intense medications are being prescribed for less and less severe pain realities. Just the way it happened. Nobody's really to blame. It's just about, I guess it has to do with, the psychology of the American and the medical institutions. Regardless, we are now where we are because of these factors. All right. What helps to bring all this to the forefront is the beginning of a society that is called ASAM, the American Society of Addiction Medicine. And we see its genesis occur mostly in the orthopedic community, with orthopedic practitioners and doctors, because they really are the ones that deal with chronic pain a lot, breakages, damages, surgeries of this thing. And they're noticing a trend in people becoming physically dependent as well as psychologically addicted on pain pills, which are at times quite necessary for just living, for managing life on life's terms. So they start to form this idea. They want to be more informed. Excuse me. Want to be more informed about the pathology of addiction, because remember, a lot of times they were reticent to take these classes in medical school if they were even offered. So they start to see their patients having problems and they want to become more informed, and they form this society where there's information that is freely available. Also, part of it is the American kind of perception, that the American dream, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of a vibe, which is awesome, but it tends to reflect that diminishes the understanding of the disease model of addiction because of certain stigmas that occur. All right. So, wait, let me go back real quick. Oops, wrong way. So, ASAM, they become more aware, they become more amenable to participation in disease models, and more less reticent and more amenable to sending people to 12-step fellowships, because now there's starting to be somewhat social acceptability. The blossoming of Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step fellowships, Narcotics Anonymous, CA, all these things are really starting to get traction in modern society. And they really start to allow this three-way modeling to gain ground in the minds of physicians in America. I see that we're approaching the time.
We'll do question and answer. So
when?
You got like 8 more minutes.
We'll do a few more minutes, and then we'll feel free to do any questions and answers. You can submit, and I'll take them one-on-one. So let's look at the next model, right? So that's the beginning of medical modeling in the United States. It comes into a specific model for alcoholism and drug addiction diagnosis and treatment, and it becomes the biopsychosocial model. I'm going to draw on the board a little bit so you can see me. So the way this model works is that there is a biological component, a sociological component, and a psychological component.
We can't hear you.
There is a biological component, a sociological component, and a psychological component. And these fit in the triumvirate of a diagnostic model. And this model is very, very effective in diagnosis. However, it tends to be less effective in terms of treatment, because under the modeling procedures of medical models, all 3 factors have to be engaged for the disease to be active, which in turn means that if I can remove one of those factors entirely, the disease will actually go into true remission and it will be cured. So I could isolate myself from the rest of the world, probably not so smart. Well, biological, I could die. That would cure my alcoholism and addiction immediately. I could get a frontal lobotomy, also probably highly effective. A little extreme. That leaves the only really available factor to be removed is a sociological factor, which means I could put myself, draw you a little picture. I could put myself on a desert island with a nice palm tree, right? And sit here and go fishing, right? Woo! And be sober. And as long as I'm on that island all by myself, sociologically deprived from every other human being on the planet, I'm going to be sober. My alcoholism is going to be cured. But all of a sudden, the party boat comes out of nowhere to rescue me, and there's a happy guy who's happy to see me, and he's holding a bottle of tequila. And all of a sudden, my removal from the sociological component is no longer real. And I'm going to be drunk again. And that's just how it works. So even though it's a sound idea, it is in fact highly impractical because I cannot isolate myself or lock myself up forever. And oddly enough, in the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous, that was the accepted treatment modality, to be shut up in an insane asylum or an alcoholic sanitarium from now until the end of time, thereby removing myself from any possible damage because of the agent and harm, the drug or alcohol that I like to consume, and thereby, in essence, being cured. Horrible to live that way. Horrible way of life. So, although it is logically a sound model, it is fairly ineffective as a treatment modality. However, it has become very effective as an advanced diagnostic aid for treatment models. Because what it does is it factors the biological components, my genetic predisposition, how I respond and my metabolize alcohol, these things, along with my psychological components, which are trauma, right? Things of that nature. These are brought into play. Right? The next slide shows the biological, genetic predisposition, allele grouping, which is the number of switches that sit on the RNA that actually make up the group that gives me a predisposition for alcoholism. So let's talk a little bit about that before we get into the psychological. So interestingly enough, what we know from the Human Genome Project is that about 15% of the world's population has 4 out of 7 of these minimal alleles, which constitute the grouping for addiction predisposition, which means that about 15% of the world's population has an 80% or greater chance of becoming an active addict in their life. 15% of the world's population has a high probability, which is 80% plus, to become an active alcoholic. What we know worldwide, because of World Health Organization numbers, is that the actual population of the world that is in fact an active addict is only 10%. This 10% is 100% in that section of having those genetic predispositions vis-a-vis these alleles, these on-off switches that occur on the genetic marker, right? If you look at one of these, it's these little switches, right? And they're not markers for like, oh, he likes cocaine or he likes tequila. What they are is they tend to be neurological markers. Heavy production of oxytocin, empathy drug, love drug, which makes us feel things more than others, along with other different types of markers, usually related to neurochemistry and the combination of those neurochemicals together. Here's the question, and we don't know the answer to it yet, but this information will actually help increase the efficacy of treatment worldwide. 15% of the world population has a very, very high probability to become an alcoholic. And only 10% does. That means of this entire population, 1/3 dodges that bullet. And it's not because they don't drink, and it's not because they don't smoke, and it's not because they don't party. It's for whatever reason it is that is so far unknown to us. When we find that out, it'll give us more insight into the treatment of alcoholism and drug addiction. This is one of those numbers. It also is the thing that reinforces with complete validity the disease model of alcoholism and drug addiction. It is the thing that reinforces that this is a brain disease, specifically since it operates in a neurochemical way. Okay, so that's a conundrum. Hopefully, the revelation of this information will be forthcoming And in that revelation, we'll be able to make more greater strides. Okay? Another one of the biological components is the processing of ethanol alcohol. Either genetically by predisposition or developmentally vis-a-vis the metabolism of the drinker. There is a process by which alcohol is deconstructed in the system. Got a question, Dave? Not yet. Okay. So basically what happens is alcohol is ingested. The body then processes it and brings it to, I think it's acetylene. There's a slide on the next page, I believe. There you go. Ethanol into acetaldehyde, which is a dihydrogenase, and then it's reduced again into another catalase, and then it hits acetone. Acetone then is broken down into complex carbohydrate, which then is broken into a sugar, O2, and water. In the alcoholic, what we know, either metabolically developed or genetically predisposed, is that the process of alcohol into those sugars stops at acetone for the alcoholic, the predisposed alcoholic. And again, even for those 15%, this is true, even though a third of them don't become alcoholic. And like most things, when something becomes overwhelmed and processed, the brain doesn't understand, oh, you're not processing it, don't drink anymore. It approaches it from a more pragmatic way. Oh, there's a plug. Let's slam more into it and try and break that plug through so that it can be processed into the later stages of sugars. This happens to be the major piece that creates what is called the phenomenon of craving, one of the physical reactions in the diagnosis of alcoholism set forth by Jelinek. And so it's the reason that an alcoholic or someone that really likes to drink or a burgeoning alcoholic or drug addict really wants that first drink. But boy, they really, 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 really want the 5th drink or the 10th drink, because the acetone starts to raise so high in their metabolism that the brain logically says, well, if you force more in there, it will force it to get processed. And that creates the phenomenon of craving, the desire to continue drinking regardless of what happens, right? After a protracted period of time, the response, the euphoria that comes from using drugs and alcoholism and alcohol furrows the neuro pathway. It's like cutting a groove in a corner lot that people walk diagonally across. No matter how many times they plant grass or put up that yellow tape, that groove is still there because it continues to be used. And every time it gets used, it gets grooved a little deeper because the brain is adipose tissue, which is a fat cell, which means it doesn't really regenerate, which means once a groove is dug into it, it can never be refilled. One of the hardest things about recovery from alcoholism. However, a lot of the recovery techniques don't try to fill the groove in. They, in essence, show techniques through neuroscience and neurolinguistic programming and cognitive therapy and dialectic therapy to actually dig a new path, which is deeper than the first one, because neurochemicals tend to be like water. They seek their own level. They go where there's the path of least resistance. And so after using over and over and over again, we actually become more accustomed to using, the response occurs quicker, and that really exacerbates the addictive pathology, because now do we not only have a sensational or feeling reality to it that is maybe solution-based for our dilemmas or wanting to feel, but what we have is a neurological stopgap where that thing is locked and we respond to it very well. All right, so I just got prompt from my amazing producer, Dave, that we are going to take questions and answers now. We have 5 minutes left, so if anyone would like to shoot me a question, I'd love to answer it.
So I have a question here.
Okay, question.
Do drugs like opiates, for example, metabolize the same way as alcohol? Because it seems like I think they're saying you're talking about alcohol. Does that apply to drugs as well?
It applies exactly to drugs. And oddly enough, ethanol alcohol, which is C5H2OH, which is alcohol, has no receptor in the brain of its own accord. It fits exactly, perfectly like a key in a lock into the opioid receptor, which produces norepinephrine and dopamine. So really the process of opioids specifically is nearly identical to the process of alcohol. When we talk about stimulants and other drugs, which we will get into when we start to discern them, we understand that although they may affect a different neuroreceptor, in essence, they operate the same way. What we find is that the physiological processes may have less metabolic resistance, but what happens is that the neurological processes become furrowed even quicker, specifically with things like cocaine and amphetamines, as well as heroin and opioids. Really, I'm going to be speaking a lot about alcohol, but it's without, besides some subtleties or neurological differences, really the effect, the patterning, and the pathology are identical.
So
Identical.
it looks like Jackie and Jerry are also wondering about methamphetamine and methadone, if we're going to talk about those at all, if anything will be, if there's any differences.
Well, methadone is a unique drug for opiates because it operates on two platforms. It is an agonist and an antagonist. That means it prevents the activity in the neuroreceptor of opioid-based realities and simultaneously prevents the desire for those and quells the response of that neuroreceptor. Methadone, it's a bit of a problematic drug. It was never designed to be a maintenance drug over a period of time, and has become that, and has been kind of co-opted by this sort of like clinic-based reality where they continue to increase dosages over a period of time. And unfortunately, you end up with people that are quote unquote lifers that are consistently in a sort of haze-based reality. It may be diminished faculties, but really it's not a full life. It's not a full engagement. However, what it was originally designed for was a detoxification medicine. Has a very, very high efficacy, and used correctly in a short period detox protocol, short period titration is very effective in the diminishment of opioid addiction.
Okay, so a couple other questions here. We have a couple questions regarding marijuana. Some people say that it's different than other drugs and it's okay. Is this true?
No. Okay, let me explain it to you. All right, so here's the thing about marijuana. So I'm going to assume none of you are 20 or 25 or 30. I'm going to assume you're probably older adults, somewhere in my age range. I'm not going to tell you how old I am. But the weed that you might have smoked 30 years ago is nowhere near the weed that you smoke today. And here's another thing. The old argument for marijuana was that, you know what? It's not like drinking, nobody like smokes weed and then goes home and beats their wife. Like if they drink a bottle of Jack Daniels, it's mellow. I smoke all the time. Doesn't bother my thing. Well, that's great. And it's great because 30 years ago, it might have been true. Today, it's not. And I'll tell you why. So there are two specific psychotropic compounds in marijuana, CBD, which operates both neurologically and metabolically to help tremors and pain. And it's really the medical part of marijuana. And the other one is THC. Now, there happens to be multiple types of THC in marijuana. The most important one is delta-9 THC. Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol is what is called a psychotropic hallucinogen that affects multiple neuroreceptors. It affects the opioid receptor, it affects the stimulant receptor. It is a really, really strong drug. And by volume, and here's what it is. This particular drug, by volume, is the single strongest psychotropic hallucinogen that occurs naturally, which means it's less potent than, say, acid, LSD, and microdoses. However, in terms of micrograms, it is about 40 times more potent than, say, the same microgram of pure psilocybin, which is the hallucinogenic component in mushrooms. What occurs is because this particular drug has a huge bioavailability, that means the absorption rate in the brain once it crosses the blood-brain barrier, is extremely high, that it reaches saturation levels. And here's the problem with this particular drug. It is a cannabinoid. Cannabinoids exist in the brain. In fact, every drug that you ingest has a twin or doppelganger neurochemical that exists in your brain, with the exception of alcohol, which fits into the opioid receptor. And the cannabinoid that exists in your brain has one job and one job alone, and that job is to regulate anxiety. If you could sit on your couch and watch television or watch sports and get a paycheck every week for your job without ever having to go to it, would you? I would. So basically your brain operates the same way. If I saturate my brain with delta-9 THC, which is a cannabinoid, my brain stops producing the organic cannabinoid that regulates anxiety. This particular cannabinoid does not regulate anxiety, which means that I start to have an anxiety disorder from smoking weed. And the saturation levels are so high that it happens quickly. And the old argument that nobody got violent or had dissociative episodes or psychotic episodes is no longer true. They absolutely do. And on top of that, the age-old hippie adage of it's natural is also not true, because there's no such thing as marijuana that is not genetically modified now. Marijuana is a vicious drug, and its present potency and genetic strains can cause huge damage and long-term neuroside effects for its users.
Okay, so guys, we're getting a lot of questions, and they're all really good questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time to get to all of them, so I'm going to have Mark answer one more question on the webinar. If we don't get to your questions now, we're going to follow up. Rabbi is going to email you responses to your questions. We're going to try and answer everybody's questions in a timely manner. So,
show of hands. You do. All right. Hit me with a good one, Dave.
Okay, so during the course of this 8 to 10 week seminar,
Sure.
are you going to be addressing addiction in people that have dual diagnosis with serious mental illness, maybe borderline personality disorder, for example, or things of that nature?
Well, we could, but what I'm trying to give you, how do I put this? A lot of the information that I'm going to present is the basic information vis-a-vis addiction organically in the human being. That can be addressed with co-occurring disorders or other psychological disorders, and those exacerbate the situation and approach different techniques for diagnostics as well as treatment modalities. However, what we have to remember consistently when it comes to dual diagnosis is that someone who is an addict and also say is borderline or has an access to whatever personality disorders, no more access to's, they have two valid diseases that have to be addressed with equal aggression and strength. You have to pursue them aggressively and address them both. One of the biggest problems with dual diagnosis is when people get their mental health issues under control, they believe that their addiction has somewhat been sublimated and is no longer a critical factor, or vice versa. They address their alcoholism and drug addiction through a paradigm of 12-step or therapy or cognitive work, and in doing so, they think that the minimization of their mental health issue is gonna follow suit. It's never the truth. It's always the truth that both of these things have to be addressed aggressively and treated aggressively. Here's the deal. Fixing one doesn't fix the other, but not fixing one absolutely makes the other worse. So when it goes up, it does. They're not. You don't just work on one, but if you don't work on one, the other one goes down every single time. They exacerbate each other, but do not heal each other. And so we're going to give a lot of general information. To be perfectly frank, if we were to get into all the minutiae and subtleties, this would be a 55-week course. So we're going to try and give you as much comprehensive information that you can then take to the next level in your own research or in private counseling or through questions that you ask me online. And I would like to wrap up with an introduction to the man who has made this all possible. This is my boss and the CEO of Recovery Bootcamp, Timothy Schnellenberger.
Hey everybody. I hope you like the show. the webinar. You did a great job. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Okay.
All right, don't hate me. I'm still an alcoholic and my ego can't take it. All right, I hope to see you all next week. That would be awesome.
Yeah, so again, we thank you guys for joining us. I think this was a big success. Any feedback you can provide, we're going to be in a follow-up email that you're all going to receive. We're going to send you a survey. There's going to be a few questions. They're pretty much technical questions. Were you able to see the presentation? Were you able to hear okay? Was it difficult logging in? Were you able to get in no problem? Just basic questions like that. And don't forget, any questions that Mark didn't get to tonight, he will be following up via email this week. So hopefully you'll have some answers to your questions. And if there's any more questions, this is just week one. So I'm sure we're going to have more time to answer questions going forward each week. So the most important thing is that we see you here again next week so that we can answer your questions then.
And the workbook will be ready.
And we're putting together a workbook that's going to have all the slides with the PowerPoint presentation, room for notes. And we're going to try and make that available to be in the handout section next week, if not before. So you'll be able to download that and have it in front of you. So as Mark's talking, you're going to be able to take notes on the slides he's talking about. All right, and I think that's it. You got anything else you want to?
Nope. I had fun.
So did I. Appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week.
Broadcast.
What slide number is that? 16.